Hi everyone. Hello. My name is Bryant Francis. I am visible for once. I'm actually a face that you can see. Instead of just hiding out in the corner, or in the invisible corner, that is. I am joined. I'm a contributing editor by Gamasutra. I'm really getting this in the right order today. I am joined up above me by three awesome level design faces that you should all know. Um, in order, Beth, Robin, and Harrison, could you please introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Beth Beinke Schwartz. I'm a senior level designer at Certain Affinity in Austin, Texas.
I'm Robbie Storm. I used to be a game and level designer and then went into tools design and worked recently at IO Interactive.
Hi, I'm Harrison Pink. I worked at Telltale Games for a number of years, created Tales from the Borderlands, worked on Walking Dead. Most recently, I worked at Hangar 13 on Mafia 3.
Awesome. Yeah, and you all may be wondering, if you haven't read the screens around us yet, why Doom is playing around while we chat and then talk to designers today. It's because we're here today to talk about level design and making good game levels. And because I am but a humble contributing editor and not really a master level designer, I could only just boot up Doom SnapMap tool and start fiddling around and trying to make something cool and interesting. So to get some help with that, I reached out to Beth, Robin, and Harrison here because I just wanted to pick their brains about how they do their work, what makes good level design, how they can use level design tools to make magical things happen, and other questions of the sort. If you're in the audience and watching today, be sure to ask questions in the chat. We'll be grabbing them if you want to know anything about working in Unity, and like what's some good, like how what really is the value of a T junction, stuff like that. Hopefully someone here will have an answer for you, and if they don't, we'll just all have a good laugh, and I'll just boot up the level and show how bad I am to cover for them. To get things started, I'm about to just dive in and sort of pick up where I left off on my little mission here, which is to recover an AI's body. That's sort of the mission I'm trying to set up for a player here. And my first question will be, could each of you, I know like there's a list of questions in the chat, this is not the first one that's on there, could each of you sort of, in order from Beth to Robin to Harrison, sorry, we're just going to set in order so that people know how to talk, sort of talk about how you got into level design and what you think makes it such a interesting craft.
Sure, yeah. So I started out going to school thinking, oh, what do I want to do? I don't know, biology? It seems cool, it's sciencey. And then there was a fledgling program at my college, WPI, that was games, that was very early stages, so they only really had art or programming as an option. And so I started out learning how to make environment art props, and I quickly realized I don't really like making the props. I just like using them in cool ways and building spaces and uh, manipulating players to go where you want them using psychology reasons. And the appeal of level design is that you can kind of mix kind of an art creative perspective and also technical logical stuff with scripting and things. And a lot of times people think, oh, you have to pick one or the other, whereas level design is kind of in the middle, and you get to be the glue between everything. And so bringing everything together is what really appealed to me.
My reasons are very, very similar for liking level design. So how I got into level design was I started out way back in the day on Red Alert 1 and like the level editor, the level editor.
Oh, good.
It's just such a great system, being able to just put something together, much like SnapMap, just placing a couple of things, hitting play, and just seeing it was awesome. So I got into that, and what I again also really like about level design is you put everything together. You have these amazing people making amazing content, and you put it into the shape that the player will go through, either from point A to point B or like some different way. But you'll get to put things together in a way that looks good, that it plays well. Having that focal point and doing that work is super fun.
Yeah, I went to art college. I went to Savannah College of Art and Design, and they had an interactive design major. And because it's a visual arts college, like the only way that they could express that, because there wasn't a lot of programming or like systems design or spreadsheeting kind of thing, was through visual art, which was through level design. So I did a ton of level design in Unreal Tournament 2004, I think was the hotness back then. So like Unreal ED2, I think was the program. And I did that for the time I was at college. And then I left, and I didn't touch level design for many years, actually. I went and worked at like a startup that did children's games and virtual worlds for kids, which were really hot in 2008. And then I worked at Telltale for like 3.5, 4 years, which doesn't have a ton of like combat flow and pacing and stuff because those games are very narratively driven. So it wasn't actually until I went to Hangar 13 2.5 years ago where I actually got to start diving back into those skills, working on sort of the so on Mafia 3, the base game, I worked on a lot of the open world, like quote unquote backyards, what they call them. And then I also did a bunch of mission design for Stones Unturned, the second DLC that came out last month. And that was much more like focused on the sort of like single driving forward, not open world, just like starting at point A and going to point B and being able to sort of control the what the player sees and what the player experiences in what order. And it sort of like reignited my love for doing that kind of stuff. So.
Awesome. My first question after the introductions is, what tools have you used in your work? Like, how have you physically built the levels that you've made in your work? And what do you think works well about them, and what do you think sort of could be improved about them? This sort of goes to a talk Robin has given at GDC about keeping level designers in the flow while they're working on tools.
Do you want to go first, Robin, then?
Sure, I guess I could. You could go after that, yeah. So yeah, I did an hour-long talk which you can find on YouTube called "Keeping Level Designers in the Zone Through Level Editor Design," and what basically I've used a lot of different tools in my work. Because I used to be in indie development, then I worked at companies, then I did freelance, then I worked at like larger companies. So I've done both in-house and a lot of external tools, like public tools. And the thing that they all sort of like are different things in different ways. Like, one level editor can be really good at doing terrain, and another one can be really slow at doing terrain. And one can be really easy at putting logic together and understanding the logic and debugging the logic. While other tools might be really difficult to set up, and a programmer has to do it for them. One thing that I, for example, with iInteractive on the Hitman editor, Glacier, is one thing we worked on is improving, for example, cover placement. So you have pieces of cover that people can be behind, but in what way do you place those? And we made that system a lot faster.
Sure, I'll go. I'll just keep going in a loop, I guess. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think, yeah, one of those things, just to sort of key off what Robin said, is that every editor that I've worked on is good and bad at certain things, and it's just comes from what the company's goals are or what the aim of the game is. Like the tools used on Mafia 3 are all proprietary tools, and they were focused very heavily on making a really, really solid open world game. So it focused on the things you need for those types of games. Cover placement, prop location, like streaming, like much more massive stuff and more massive in scale, enemy spawning, running sort of like pedestrian AI and that kind of stuff. But, you know, it might not have the same kind of like granular ability to change lighting or change like prop placement as easily as some other engines might, where that kind of stuff is really important. Or like a heavily stealth focused game like Hitman might sort of be able to sort of give you more tools to figure out like blind spots and corners and cover in that sort of way. The tools that are being used to create a world game might not have those things. So it really just comes down to the focus of the product that the company has been working on. The Telltale tool, and this is not a level design thing, but it was incredibly good at doing dialogue, as you might guess. So it didn't have a ton of really strong level design tools because it didn't need them, much to my chagrin sometimes when you're actually trying to design a space that you can walk around. So yeah, it's I've never actually professionally worked in anything but proprietary tools. I did a bunch of stuff in Unity. But it was mostly, it seems like these days, most companies have their own sort of proprietary engine that is used by them or the parent company.
Yeah, and for me, yeah, I've worked with a lot of different tools as well. When I was at Irrational, we worked with Unreal, but we had a lot of engineers creating new functionality on top of the engine, which was awesome. So we could really customize it to what we really needed for the project. And that is what you often see with the proprietary tools, like because the company I'm at, Certain Affinity, does a lot of code development with other studios like Harrison. Some of us, including myself, worked with them on Mafia 3, and so I got to use their tools, which was awesome for open world design. But may not have been as good for like when we were working on Doom multiplayer, for example, where the engine that works with that is really great at prototyping space levels and flows out really quickly and just get in and go. But an open world game has different requirements and different things to think about. But I think my favorite functionality is usually visual scripting, like you see in Unreal and stuff, especially if it's all on kind of one page that you can see the flow of it, because a lot of times with level design, you're often doing scripting on the level side. And so being able to see kind of a visual map of the progression and what everything's going on the level is super important. I'm not as huge of a fan of when scripting is based on objects, because it's very easy to accidentally have something happen, and tracking things down is really difficult. But once again, it really depends on the project.
Cool. I am going to skip ahead in the questions that I sent you all and ask what sort of one thing you learned about level design that you know about level design now that you wish you knew like 5-10 years ago.
Beth, start off.
Yeah.
Start things out smaller than you think. Layouts are often too big when you first bring it in, even if you're designing on a paper map. And I still do that myself sometimes. But starting out smaller usually helps. And also, I guess I wish I had realized like 10 years ago what a drastic difference there is between each game and what is important for the level design in each. Because I feel like part of my job as a level designer is to figure out what's important about the gameplay of each level and figuring out how to move in that space. And especially like single player versus multiplayer is the easy identifier. But even working on a single player open world game like Mafia 3, the level design and how to do that is a lot different than say single player level like Bioshock Infinite.
Real quick, Beth, you're getting quiet all of a sudden.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there we go.
I'll talk closer.
Yeah.
So I guess realizing that there are some standards in level design, but a lot of it is researching what's important about each type of game, and that each type of game has totally drastically different levels.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Robin, go for it.
Okay, so what I would say that I would have loved to have learned 5 years ago is that in the early phases of making levels, if someone sort of has feedback about a certain area or something, to not just like move a box or something like that to sort of see what that changes, but just remove an entire wall, remove an entire section, and retry doing that area in a different way. And when you're in the later stages, when everything is fully detailed up and everything, of course, do tiny changes in that way. But I've learned that when you're starting early with something, don't be afraid to just fully throw away this thing and do it anew, just to see what works best. Because usually you'll just bump into it. You're not perfect. You're always learning. So you'll bump into it. So just keep removing and trying again.
Yeah, sometimes it's better just to throw a whole level out and start new than to try to make something work when it's not going to work.
Yeah, sometimes that saves time, not takes time.
I'll have a question about
totally
that
agreed.
in a second, but I'm going to let Harrison get his answer in.
I used to want to just jump in and start throwing shit into a space. That's how I kind of learned, is just sort of iterative, just opening a level editor with a blank screen, just going wild. But the thing that I've learned over time is, and as well as the things that the other two panelists said, which are totally true, that starting with the paper sketch actually is super useful. And that's actually what I did. So I worked on the bunker level in the DLC, in DLC 2. And that, starting off with a paper sketch of what that was going to be just with pencil and paper, helped sort of figure out the pace, like basic pacing really quickly. That the bunker was going to be like have multiple branching paths and sort of be non-linear and stuff, and it quickly figured out between the pencil prototype and the like gray block prototype that just wasn't going to work. for many reasons that we can talk about later. But like taking your time and planning it out and trying to figure out what you're trying to accomplish and like what's the story you're trying to tell and like do all the sort of brainy, not fun, not getting your hands dirty stuff and not skipping that is way more important than I would have thought when I first started.
Yeah, so quick follow-up question, and then I'm going to get to a question from the chat about the throwing it out thing. How do you, especially sometimes if other team members are involved, how do you sort of like weigh like the speed of throwing it out and rebuilding it quickly versus like not getting rid of the work you've already put into it? I guess I sort of can hear the answer to the question in my own head is that you aren't throwing away all the work you've done, you're just rebuilding what you've learned. But like maybe not everyone on your team is fully on board with that. Like how do you sort of grapple with that?
I think it helps to keep it in early gray box stage before art comes in for as long as possible so that you can have people run around in the space before art takes the time to art it up fully. And that can be very frustrating, especially for artists when they've made everything beautiful and you're like, oh, it doesn't work, let's throw it out. But it's really easy to make quick changes, obviously, if you're in gray box mode. And yeah, it's hard to tell. It's kind of an ambiguous state of how do you know when to throw it away or not. But I guess try to keep it in the early stages as long as possible.
Yeah, I'd agree with the same thing. It's just like if you're really early on and you're using like just blocks and you're putting them together, it's very simple to make something really big and to scale it down to really small without losing work. So in that case, the call to completely remove an area, do it again, is easy because you can just go like, yeah, I can rebuild it in like a couple of minutes or a couple of hours. If you're later on in the project and there's NPCs now walking around a thing, or there's lighting that someone has placed and they put a lot of time to that, or there's logic that's contained to something like a quest or a mission somewhere else, then of course that thing becomes much more complicated and becomes much more of a thing of like, okay, how much here do we cut considering we have to redo X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I think that, and luckily the way that we worked at Hangar 13 is we have a ton of just props lying around that you can use to sort of like imply a space before you get any sort of custom art or the artists go in and make it look really, really pretty. So you can sort of imply like this space is supposed to be the barracks, this space is supposed to be the kitchen or whatever, before you ever have to get an artist to start spending their like time really like hard and start wasting time. And the other thing that's really good is, you know, when you have a lot of peers that are also level designers and also sort of like really strong mission designers, that they can sort of imagine what it's going to look like. They can see down the end of the tunnel and say like, oh yeah, I can see this, like what you're trying to get at here. So you don't have to have all the props placed and all the bottles in the correct locations, all the crates and ammo and stuff exactly where it needs to be, because you can say like, this is the rough gray box layout of the space. This is what I'm trying to accomplish. This is the kind of pacing I want here. This is the story I'm trying to tell of the space. This is what I want the player to experience here. And your peers will be able to go, oh yeah, like I totally see where you're going at. Maybe shift the room 90 degrees and you'll get a better flow through the space. Cover will be more apparent when you first come in the room. Nobody will get shot from the sides or whatever. And so, yeah, I would just say being able to sort of leave it as gray blocky and early and easy to move things around with simple shapes as long as possible, and then just know what you're trying to accomplish, and then you can talk to your peers about those things and they'll usually understand where you're coming from and sort of be able to visualize it in their head.
Gotcha. The first question from the chat we're going to call comes from JReedVic7. Pacing in all games feels like a fleeting thing. How do you manage minute-to-minute pacing in the levels you're designing? With that, what's the delineation between good and great level design as far as managing pace? That's a really good question. I'm just going to give a shout out to thanks for making my job easier, Jay Reed.
That's a tough one. Once again, it really depends on what kind of game you're trying to make. I mean, if it's a multiplayer game where you have like maybe 10 to 15 minute match, then you want to have the pacing really quick. And well, it depends. Once again, if it's a game like Doom, which is very fast paced and everyone wants to get in the action really quickly, then designing a smaller level that has a lot of forced encounters is great. And so thinking about pacing in terms of the time to engagement. But say for something like, I don't know, like a multiplayer game where it's a bit slower, maybe like, I don't know, World of Tanks or something, where Everyone kind of starts out slow, and it kind of progresses over, almost like League of Legends, but even slower. Then thinking about pacing is a little bit differently because it's like a slower paced game, and so it really depends on the pacing of the game and the experience as to how you design the level to accomplish that.
Yep, I agree. It's very much dependent on the game. If you're making a let's say a linear shooter, in that case, you know exactly where a player will be, where they're looking at in the specific case, and how long it took them to get there. So from a playtesting standpoint, you now have data. You know the time and exact thing of how to get somewhere. And if you realize that if you put three fights, like three boss fights next to each other, it becomes annoying or the pacing feels off, then you can quickly edit that. The problem, of course, is when you're making like an open world game, because in this case, anyone can go anywhere at any time, unless you have some kind of barring somewhere, some kind of gating system. Then it becomes much more difficult to find out what's going on. But I think a really good way of, for example, The Witcher 3 did this, is when you're following a quest line, you start the quest, you get sort of into the story. So in that case, even though it's open world, you go through this linear step program. So you can sort of control the pacing there yourself, because a person will probably start this quest and continue it on if they're all next to each other and you've made the level design in such a way that they want to go from one point to the next. So that's a sort of easier way to control the pacing problems that you might get in an open world game.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that it really, again, it comes down to the type of game, and there's no correct way to do these things. It's so dependent on the thing you're trying to do. So I would say that your spaces should always be smaller than you think they should be. They should probably have one more or less enemy that you probably put in. And it's amazing how one more enemy or one less enemy can completely change the dynamic of an encounter. The thing to remember is you should probably place most of what you want the player to see on the crit path, because they're not going to go off crit path very often, especially in like an action game or like Mafia 3, the mission stuff. You know, you should always hide little fun things on the sides, but don't expect players to see those things. And then there's really just like basic gating things you can use to slow players down when you want them to, like doors. The bunker had like hallways with like doors on each end, and there's a period of time that it takes for a door to open, or the animation to play, that is a moment that they can breathe and like take a second. In fact, we use that to great effect in the bunker of Mafia 3 DLC 2, because there's a bunch of the bad guy taunting you Bioshock style over the PA, and we wanted to try and like give the player the opportunity to hear that even if they were running through the level. So we placed a bunch of closed doors and a bunch of little like offices you can explore with like loot and like ammo and stuff in those rooms, just so that you didn't run into the next fight while that was still playing, because you totally could do that, but you can use little distractions like little side rooms, little crates to search through, or little secrets to find, to slow players down and keep them in that exploring sort of mindset. And to Robin's point, like if you put 3 rooms with 6 enemies or 7 enemies per room next to each other, you just get exhausted and you're not having fun anymore. And it's not even a difficulty thing; it just becomes samey. So, having rooms where the player can restock, find some ammo, find a health crate, find a piece of story. In between those fights, have a moment where you can have some banter between the characters, of the two or three characters on the screen, to sort of break up the emotional pacing. I think is the way to look at it. That can be really helpful too.
Yeah.
So just one more quick thing. I remember when I was doing a bit of research when working on Bioshock Infinite, I was trying to look at pacing to see what other games, what ratio of active combat to just wandering around, looking at narrative stuff or picking loot or things, and what was the ratio there. And similar games to first-person shooter, narrative-based, tend to do about 50-50. So like only half the time is actually in combat, and the other half is wandering around, traversing through spaces or narrative beats or things. And I found that surprising, because it feels like you're in combat a lot more than you actually are, but giving you the downtime, as they were saying, to kind of rejuvenate helps.
Mm-hmm. I think a really great example of like the pacing done well is if you play through Half-Life Episode 2, because there's just like there's really big combat sections, and then the sections where you're just waiting for someone else to open up a door. And you're just standing there, you're looking at them, there's a conversation, something's going on. And in Portal 2, you can also notice this, where after you've completed a level, you usually get something like of an audio thing or some kind of conversations happening from GLaDOS. And in that case, the elevator to take you to the next room doesn't go unless that conversation's done. Unless that full dialogue is done, it doesn't go. So it gives you a little bit of time of just to relax before you go to the next big thing that you have to solve.
Just going to the comments again. Insomnia Art says they feel bad for X-level designer. They had him redo a huge area 4 times for an old project, and then they had to throw the whole thing out. This happened 2 times. No wonder he wanted to go another way. At least he loved doing it. Insomnia Art, are you actually from Insomniac Games? Because that sounds a lot like what I've heard about some talks I've heard about Sunset Overdrive's development. My next question, Jay Reed's got another question, but I'm going to scoot back over here.
Wait, can I actually comment on that for a second?
Sure thing.
That's actually pretty low, his numbers there.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, redoing one area 4 times and then throwing it out, that's like super low. So.
Which is sad to say.
So your level designer may have left for another reason. Oh, it's a full indie guy. Or gal, I can't tell. So it wasn't Sunset Overdrive. I'll just state that for the record. Well, hopefully your level designer was just leaving for not terrible reasons then. My next question then, in order, Beth, Robin, Harrison. When looking outside of games, looking outside of other great game levels and such, what are some of the references you rely on to like how you think a space should work and how you think they communicate information to people well?
Architecture has been a huge influence. We have a few people at our studio who are actually ex-architects, but they got bored designing nursing homes and decided that they wanted to design levels instead, especially when you don't have real-life considerations like gravity and light and real purposeful air ducts and not the gameplay air ducts that we use. But a lot of architecture is about how it motivates people in the space to feel. And so using certain ways to differentiate spaces, making you feel like this is a space where you want to stay here, this is a space where you need to flow through, ways to, I like to use the word manipulate, but that usually has a negative connotation, but kind of subtly encourage people to be more interested in one area over another, especially when you want to say, this is the main path and these are alternative paths. And so architecture, I've been reading a lot of books recently about architecture, but also there's like a lot of cinematic movies, obviously. I mean, like the Alien series obviously has been a huge influence on especially FPS game levels. There's just pretty much everything.
Yeah,
I actually had designed a level once that was inspired based off of a design of a leaf that I found while I was on a hike. So,
dang, that's really cool, actually.
It didn't end up that way though, because it wasn't well balanced. But it was the beginning inspiration.
Confirmed, leaves make for poor level design. Robin, go for it.
Sure. So yeah, I totally agree with the architecture thing. There's this great book called 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School. It's really, really good. Like, it's just 101 pages of tiny things of like, hey, you should probably think about this. Like, where does the sun come up? And how does this area flow for people? And how can you make this area not annoying for people? And one thing that I, outside of level design, look at that is, for example, I love Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands because it's huge. It's really big. And there's so many stores and so many things going on. But whenever I fly and I go through there, I go to the exact same place. I know exactly what it looks like. I know exactly where to go. That's basically a space where millions of people need to go through the exact channel so everything goes well and safely. Like, looking at that kind of architecture, about how they do it, about the signage, about the lighting, showing you where you walk. Like, do they do like decals on the floor with like footsteps, or do they use a light at the end of like a long tunnel, or all kinds of things? Like, looking at those real world examples of how can you get a million people to walk in the right way, even though they all need to go separate ways, is super interesting and really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's a really super, super good point. Looking at spaces as if they were real and how they would be used by real people, airports, libraries, hospitals, things like that, if you get lost or confused, it can be really bad. And even if you're designing a crazy space station or a crazy fantasy world, like in the world, it's a real place, and people have to really like use that space for a thing. So like remembering, like through architecture, remembering like what is this space used for? Why would you put a door next to another door like that? Nobody would use that space realistically, even though it makes sense for a level design. It has to really feel believable as a space first. There's that great Bioshock, I think it was a Gamasutra article actually, from like when the first Bioshock came out, about function follows form follows function. I can't remember the specific thing. Maybe you can find it online, but it's really great about like, yeah, it's a level, but it's also a space. So remember those things. And that's really good for like physical layout and making sense of a physical layout. For pacing, definitely action movies that still have a lot of things going on at once. The Bourne movies are really good because the camera's going wild and there's a big fight with guys like grabbing knives out of a block of wood or whatever. You have to understand the space to understand like the relative positions of the characters and what's going on, because otherwise you get really confused about who's hitting what, where what room are they in, where in the world are they. And horror movies for sure. Any sort of movie that really uses a space well. The movie that I keep coming back to that keeps inspiring me for pacing and not necessarily physical space is 28 Weeks Later. The pacing in that movie, for that particular movie, is insanely good. And even the like big open spaces, like they escape the city full of zombies and they're out in this big wide field that's like a playground, like an old playground. And it's super, super tense because there's nothing out there but just the music and the lighting and the like conversations they're having, and everything about that is super, super tense. So you don't even have a moment to breathe, even though the space is really large. And just, yeah, basically everything can be inspiration, but architecture for sure, and movies just as a medium that has to describe a space to you so that you understand what's going on between the characters.
Next question from the chat. Roman Looks wants to ask, they say they like how the light is used to guide the player through levels in Doom. Can you tell us more about using light in your work to sort of get information across to the player?
This delves a little bit into art, especially environment artists. They often deal with this, I think, a lot more than level designers do. But we always obviously have a base understanding and use it early on. I think I try to use it even in early gray boxes because even if it's early gray textures, lighting helps influence and direct players a little bit. Obviously, making sure that a space or an option for a path is well lit so players can quickly process and understand their options for moving around a space, especially in a multiplayer level, or maybe there's a combat arena in a single player game. Lighting helps to call things out and draw attention to spaces, which is part of what good level design is making sure players know their options, especially for combat spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that, and it's for me like making it part of the level geometry, part of the design and the lore is very much thinking like, what would this space have? What would they do? I think that's a big thing that you always see in zombie movies, or in zombie movies, also zombie games, which is that if they make a light and they don't have anything else to work with because society has fallen down, there's going to be a battery somewhere inside that system. That battery might not be amazing because it might have been years since it's been fixed because they don't have time to do that. They need to survive. So in that case, the light might flicker a little bit. And just having that light flickering, in the way you see, it's like, oh, this thing is not well maintained. So like within 1 second, a million different things get said simply because you see the light flickering. So I think especially with that, it's like thinking about what would this place have for lights? How could they do this? And in what way would they put this down? Would they make it look nice, like in a church or cathedral, having like light come up from above because they need to be like God's rays? Or is it something that needs to look a little more evil? Like, in what way would they do it, and would they make it work?
Yep, totally agree. Using light to tell a story and call things out, as Beth said, like make sure the players know all their options, make sure players can see. It's so easy to want to go really dark and never go as dark as you think. Like I call it just like video game dark. Like it's not actually pitch dark. It's not actually black. Like lights out. There should always be some sort of ambient light so you can see what's going on. We had a beat in the bunker where the bad guys cut the power to the room and then sort of like blow the doors off the hinges and surprise you. And we did a lot of work back and forth. I worked with the lighting artists, and we were lucky to have lighting artists to make sure that it felt dark and like the room had no power, but there was enough ambient light that you could see things. And we've tried to place small like desk lamps around so that you could have little pools of light that you could sort of like find ammo at. And anytime we'd find a light, we'd put ammo underneath it, or if there was ammo or a health pack, we'd put a light over it, so that the player really can be anchored to one particular piece of cover and look around a room and say like, okay, these are the locations I can go, and here's how I get the health, and here's where I can get ammo, and here's where the enemies are because I can actually see them. We gave the enemies flashlights just so you could see them moving against the darkness. So making sure that you're not, the mood is really important, but make sure your lighting isn't actually sort of the opposite purpose where you're accidentally taking options away or taking information away from the player because they can't find the doorway. The doorways were like backlit with red, so you could see them from really far away, so you knew exactly if you needed to cut and run and bail out, you knew exactly where you could run to and take cover. A lot of times, games like Doom where you're always moving, you can sort of bump into things that are important, but in games that are like cover shooters, like Uncharted or Mafia 3, you're sort of anchored to a piece of cover for a while, and you need to sort of like scope out a room and know exactly where you're going to get, or where you're going to go and how you can get there. Like, you don't want to bump into a table you didn't see, because that'll kill you. Like, that's enough to get someone killed. So making sure that you're not accidentally using light in a sort of negative way.
About taking information away from the player thing, just to add on to that, that's one of those, it's a rule until it isn't, right? Like, it is good to communicate to the player what is important and let them know where things are, unless you are specifically creating an instance where you're not. Like, especially in horror games, maybe you're creating a pool, an area that's really dark because you want to surprise the player intentionally. But that's the thing, it has to be intentional, because if unintentional things happen, as you were mentioning, Harrison, where the player accidentally bumps into something because they didn't see it and then they accidentally get killed, it's very frustrating for the player to not have control of their situation.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I like to mention also when regards to making sure it's part of design and lore and things like that. For example, Brian just put like a giant blood stream on the key that you have to find to open up the door. It's something like that. Like in other games, you might put a light on there, like have some kind of light that someone put on there to show that it's there. In Doom, would someone place a sci-fi light directly on it? Maybe not. What would they place? A giant stream of blood. Okay, in that case, that makes more sense in a sense of that sort of system. So making sure that the player can see it and that it makes sense and that it sort of, makes sense with the environment and the story. That's, I would say, is like a way of doing things, not even with light, but also with other things.
Yeah, and animation too. The fact that it's moving, like our brains are so keyed into finding the one thing that's moving on the horizon. I've been playing a lot of PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, and like I'm surprised myself constantly about how easy it is to pick people, like little tiny 3-pixel tall guys off on a horizon because nothing else is moving, but they are. So our brains are really good at finding moving stuff. So fans, little fluttery pieces of paper that are moving that can draw your attention towards a secret or a hidden walkway or something. Anything like that feels out of the ordinary can sort of pull attention in a positive or negative way.
Oh man, I actually was partly just grabbing this because it was also the object that I could sort of get to have the most. It could play across this entire room, and it was very vertical, so it would say "Go here" without me having to drop a giant "Go here" sign. So
hey, you did level design. Good work.
Woo! I did it. So I'm actually going to. I'm just layering up on this little mission for myself, and I'm gonna think about movement. I'm definitely gonna think about movement because you're right. Like the movement help. I literally confused myself. I put that key card down there, and I forgot where I put it after playtesting this room for the first time. So I'm going to think about movement as I go forward in my crappy little Doom level.
I will say also while you're working on that, like one of the things that Doom is really, really strong at, or at least the original Doom, and I felt this way partially about the new Doom, which is why I liked it so much, was that in the Matthias Warch, who's the design director at Hangar, did a really good talk a couple years ago on like Doom and on like the level design of Doom, and that game always gives you interesting options during combat. So there'll be a couple of imps, in front of you, and behind that will be a shotgunner, or maybe the shotgunner's in front of you and the imps are behind you, and you have to decide, because the shotgunner has basically a hit scan weapon, which means it hits you instantly. And the imps throw fireballs, which you can dodge, but if they get too close to you, then they can claw you for a lot of damage. You have to actually just like make it's almost like a puzzle, like who gets your attention first. So sort of like putting a bunch of enemies in a room that are different types. Like in Mafia, it was like shotgun guys and pistol guys who would actually like run towards you and throw things to like knock you out of cover. And like making sure that you always feel like you have to make a decision about priority and like what is the most important thing for you to kill right now, because the grenade guys can toss a grenade and force you out of cover, or the shotgun guy might just walk up to you shooting a shotgun, so maybe take that guy out first. So always asking the player, like, and that's really good for pacing too, always asking the player like those sort of like pacing questions about what is important for you to focus on right now, and like making them have to make tough decisions about that and learn that way is a really cool sort of part of especially Doom and level design as a whole and pacing as a whole.
Yeah, I would say.
No, good.
So adding on top of that, there's a really great way I found of doing this, of finding out what is in that split second the most important thing. Because if you let a player play through something, then you ask them what's the most important thing, they're never going to say what actually was the most important thing, because it's completely subconscious. If you're looking through a level, you're in the middle of a firefight, you make subconscious decisions about what to attack. You don't go, oh, I need to do that thing. Mm-hmm. So the cool thing I found is that if you record exactly what they're doing, and you go through it frame by frame, and you sort of see the movement of like the targeting cursor or of whatever, or the camera, what they're looking at, then you can really spot the things of, oh, this is the actual thing they're focusing on. But you have to go through it frame by frame to actually find out what that thing is, because they themselves don't even know.
There's actually some cool software now as well with eye tracking that we've used a couple times, where you can track where players are looking and see what most of their priority is focused on. But that's might not be as easy to do for like a lone indie dev in their house, you know, asking somebody else to test their level for them. But if they, as you said, if they can just record it, that also helps.
And also something to remember when you're doing level design work is that, and this might be super obvious, but I'll state it anyway, like you get really good at playing your level, and your ability to judge difficulty goes out the freaking window. So getting people who have never touched a video game to play, who love video games but have never played your video game, or have played your video game a lot but not to the new level you've made, like all those levels of skill, to be like, oh, this is actually way harder than I intended it to be, because I am just a crack shot with this game now, and nothing is difficult because I've played this level 100 times. So yeah, making sure that you don't accidentally make a really difficult game because you think it's tuned to your skill level.
Yeah.
Also, on that note, don't be a dick to playtesters. If they say that your level's hard or they're complaining about something, don't just write it off saying, "Oh, well, I saw it," or disregard somebody's feedback. Every piece of feedback is valid and useful. Maybe what they suggest you to do to fix it might not be valid, but their emotions and their feelings that they're feeling at the time means that there is some sort of problem that needs to be addressed. And so if it is too hard, maybe you make it harder or make it easier. I remember, I forget, there was a talk at one GDC where somebody was giving a talk at the about feedback, and he mentioned an example from Lands 1 or 2, I can't remember, but there was an area where players were expressing that it was too hard, and what the level designer did in response to that is make it doubly hard. And which doesn't make any sense at first until you realize that players were treating the space as if it was traversal space and not a legit combat space. Mm. And killing the amount of enemies in that space and making it harder meant people were all of a sudden taking it seriously. And so, but people just saying, oh, it's too hard, and the level designer who created the space saying, oh, but I don't feel like it's that hard, isn't the best way to go, because there obviously was an issue where the layout or the amount of enemies wasn't telling the players this is a combat space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, combining those two things is very much a thing of like, your players' thoughts and feedback is always correct. Their solutions usually aren't correct. So find out what the feedback is and then do that. A big thing of the mistakes that I made when I first started out doing level design is that to get, like as a modder, getting my stuff tested is very, very difficult. I can't just grab people off the street and pay them something or get like a testing bureau on this. I can't do that. I don't have a studio in that case. So I did a lot of playtesting together with other level designers who also played those games. However, their feedback is from a level design point of view. get actual players in your actual levels, find some way, find a server, find people who actually do that, and get their feedback, because depending on the person, that feedback might be different or might be not as accurate as the players might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. I was going to make that exact point. You did it for me, so well done.
Nice. There's a cleaning bot. I'm totally putting this cleaning bot down. Hang on, I gotta find out for this cleaning bot. Then I'll ask a question.
One of the things actually I wanted to talk about, because I see you doing it in your level, is verticality and how it's really rad and good, and it's really easy to be used badly. And I did it a lot when I was first starting out. Like we in the bunker again, we have a missile silo, and you fight your way down the missile silo. So my original design was because shooting from above, shooting down is really fun because you're really powerful and you can see everyone and they can't see you. Shooting upwards sucks because the exact opposite. You don't feel powerful. You're trying to like aim at things you can't really see because you can't really shoot up through the ground, and that sucks. But what we found was it was still just too much to deal with, especially in like a long, thin silo where there's like grates and like the catwalks are sort of see-through. And it's sort of falling apart. It was just so easy to break sightlines, and sightlines is another thing we can talk about forever. And it just became so difficult to actually get that to feel fun that we ended up just changing it so that as you go down the silo, enemies will spawn on the same level you're at, and you'll just have a firefight across the space, which is just as interesting in a different way. You can't like cross the space; they're just sort of like on the other side of the catwalks. So be careful with verticality. It can be really fun. It can be really intoxicating to add into your level, but it can also get really confusing because you're asking the player to do something that you haven't asked them to do up until that point. And sight lines are really difficult to sort of keep, unless it's a game like Doom where you're jumping up and down, you can move across the space really easily. But adding that kind of thing to your level can be really, really useful. So it's something to think about. Allowing people to sort of move between those spaces easily and not be like, where the hell are the stairs? I can't find my way back up there, is really important too.
And that's what I was going to get into. I was going to say I disagreed with you, but because at the beginning you were saying that in use in Mafia 3, which a game like especially a third-person cover shooter like Gears or Mafia 3, different heights is very frustrating to the players, and especially because it can block your view. But a lot of FPS games, verticality can be used as cover. You can use, especially in Doom where you're moving around really fast, it can allow you to allow for players to get out or into spaces quickly or out of getting shot. And especially if you can jump over the rails and jump down, if it's a game where you can respond quickly to things. But like you were saying, you have to be careful when you have a path that's down and a path that's up, that you properly add cover in the lower path to make sure that players on the lower path are not getting shot without realizing it from the top, except for very specified points. So maybe having very specific locations in between cover where, as a lower path player, you would know that there's a chance of you getting shot. But adding those intentionally instead of just having it really open is the way to go.
We're coming up on the last 10 minutes of our discussion, so I just want to remind everyone at home, if you have a question for these three wonderful level designers, please get it in the chat and we will grab it for you. You actually all answered my playtesting question without me asking it. Thank you for that. I'm gonna maybe this question's going to be like one with an impossible answer, but like I think we often hear about people praise complex levels. How do you sort of feel? What do you feel is the sweet spot for complexity? And like the answer is probably sort of going to change from game to game. But if you're able to like cite something in your work that you think was good complexity, how would you define that?
The first thing I think of isn't a game that I worked on, but I just recently finished Horizon Zero Dawn, and I think they do a great job of adding the right amount of complexity in an open world game. They have both large silhouettes of things, but also small pockets of really dense complexity, and I feel like that's the way to go for a lot of games. Not having evenly distributed complexity, but pockets of dense complexity as compared to more sparse complexity adds more variety and interest from an art side and also from a gameplay side. And clumping things together is better for cover or things, so that you can associate that whole area as one piece of cover instead of 3 separate pieces of cover, for example. Because if something is very evenly distributed, it's very boring and it adds a lot of detail that's unnecessary. So I guess it really depends on the game, because Doom, it does a good job with less complexity in terms of all the detail of props in the environments, but adds a lot of detailing in paths and the heights and the terrains, and a lot of complexity in the textures that they use. Whereas if you were working on a slower paced game, especially if it's very narrative driven and adding a lot of complexity, where players will have the time and speed to actually take in everything, works out better.
Hmm. Yeah, like in this case, I would say good complexity is appropriate complexity. Whatever is appropriate for your target audience, for your game, for the marketing, for all those kinds of things. Like I've worked on an Xbox One Connect game called Fru. Now that's an Xbox One Connect game. It needs to be fairly simple, because a lot of the people using this Connect are like families and children. So it needs to be very simple. So having flat textures, something that doesn't have too much detail, so you can easily and quickly see what's going on, is super important. If you're making a game like, for example, Hitman in this case, you need like a bunch of complexity. There's huge levels. There's all these things you can do, and people can play around with all those things, and that's what they like in that case. So finding the sort of appropriate complexity is what makes people say this is good, this is fun complexity.
Yeah, definitely both those answers are really strong. I think that what's important is to make sure you set expectations for the player. Surprises can be fun and are really important, but when you feel like something just came out of nowhere, you weren't able to plan for it, it's not, you don't feel good. I think that games are enjoyable because we sort of gain mastery over them over time. So, if you have a level with a bunch of specific types of enemies, and then you turn a corner and there's an enemy you did not expect, like you're not, like it's just come out of nowhere, doesn't feel like it fits, it just kind of, just thrown in there. You don't feel like you understand the space. You don't, like, the expectations are suddenly changed. Hitman's a great example. Like those levels all have their sort of internal logic, and a lot of times you say, "I wonder if I can do X thing," and most of the time it's true, because the world has told you in some sort of hint way that this thing might be possible, and then it allows for that thing. So expectations are always met. To Beth's point, I actually made the mistake of spreading a lot of enemies out in spaces early on, and when I was doing level design, and it felt like it was just one long combat. There was never a break. Like that combat experience didn't feel like it ever ended, because every room you went into had one or two guys, and it would just sort of trickle in through a hallway. And then once I sort of clumped them together into discrete combat spaces with discrete cover, I was able to design rooms that didn't really have any useful cover, but didn't have any enemies in them. You weren't really expected to draw too many enemies into that space. It's possible, but you didn't get a ton of enemies in that space, unless you were really trying to like screw with the game. So we were able to focus on storytelling and lighting and visuals and all that kind of thing, and it helped break up the space. And the complexity was there, but it wasn't. It didn't feel like it was just one long combat that sort of became a grind. So I think that breaking things up is really important, and giving the player sort of complex rules to sort of play with is important, but making sure that they understand that what those rules are and how they work is really important. And I would say that's more important than complexity for complexity's sake.
Yeah, to Harrison's point about enemy complexity, I feel like a lot of more junior folks often design a combat where it is like evenly spaced, like let's put each enemy here or add every single enemy type, whereas a lot of times I like to think of combat as like how many different elements can the player process in their mind and then decide to move forwards on a strategy based on that information. And so creating maybe 2 to 4 areas of threat. I like to use maybe 3, like certain clumps of spots, where maybe this area is one sniper, and then like here's some melee dudes who are gonna come run at you, and that's one. Those folks are one element in your mind that you clump together. Whereas like sniper is another element. So each element you add of complexity increases the difficulty of the experience, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your intent. And like a lot of things, as we mentioned, it's not necessarily a bad thing to break rules, but it has to be intentional.
Yeah, I remember it comes down to the old adage of like you're not done until you can't take anything else out. So just like I had my best experiences or made the best things I ever made when I was pulling things out, and complexity was there, but it was never more complexity than was strictly necessary to make the combat interesting or make the space interesting or tell a specific story. So don't feel like you have to jam everything. Because when you're level designing, you have infinite tools and infinite objects you can put in the space and infinite things you can do, but make each space about one thing. Like this room is the ambush room, and that's all it is. It's just a couple guys, and you kill them, and then more guys show up, and that's the one thing it does. So pulling things out until you can't pull out any more without undermining the specific like pacing and complexity that you feel like is required is a really it's an old adage, an old level design adage, but it's super super true.
All right. I don't see any more questions in the chat. As I ramble through the closure, this is your last chance to get them in, just a heads up. But yeah, thank you, Beth, Robin, and Harrison. Thank you so much for joining today. This was a lot of fun, and I'm very proud of my little stupid level, even though I just discovered a bug I don't know how to fix, which is if you die after this door opens and that door locks, you're just sent back to the spawn area where you can keep going through the mission without having to go through this area.
You found the 99% of level design, which is not as fun as the rest of it.
Gotcha. Well, thank you all for tuning in to the Gamasutra Twitch channel. We have been talking level design today. If you're just joining us towards the end of the show, we'll be archiving the whole thing to go on Gamasutra.com. If you enjoyed this conversation and getting answers to these kind of questions, we invite you to follow the Gamasutra Twitch channel because we are always interviewing developers, talking to them about their work, trying to get answers about how they make their games to help you make your games even better. I'm Brian Francis. I'm a contributing editor to Gamasutra, and I have been joined by Elizabeth Benke Schwartz, Robin Jan Storm, and Harrison Pink. And thank you, Roman Looks. We have one last question before we go today. Just as the game starts breaking too. That's wonderful. What is going on here? This is a strange bug. I'm going to ask the question while I'm trying to fix this. What do you think is the bad level that you've made, and why was it bad? So we can learn from your mistakes.
Man, that is a tough one. That is a loaded question.
He asked you to name a bad level from another game, and I didn't want you to throw your fellow game developers under the bus. That's why I asked you to go back to your own work.
I'm going to reframe that and say something that I was working on a design for a level, and that a reason why I had to throw it out was I was making a multiplayer level, and I had designed a lot of doorways.
Can you lean into the camera again?
Yeah, I designed a lot of doorways that are kind of parallel to each other so that when the player entered one door, they would exit through the other. And I found that the sight lines were horrendous. And I kept trying to shift where the doors were in relation to each other, but it just wasn't working. And so I just had to throw it out and think about when I redesigned another level of creating door frames that were not parallel to each other, maybe like 90
We are losing your mic again, sadly.
90 degree perpendicular angle so that players who entered a room would not immediately see each other and had time to process and respond. And so that's something I designed, where I was used to designing single player beforehand. And so that was my first try, and it played horrendously, and people would just die without knowing why, because the sight lines were so long, and sight lines are immensely important in multiplayer games.
Robin, your answer.
Sure. So a pretty bad thing that I did is that I once worked on really early on, a platformer game where we had moving platforms. And the thing is that while those platforms were like a part of the game design and moving from one to the next was really fun, it was like a 3D sort of like ball physics game, like a really simple thing that most people have worked on. The problem was that those things moved very, very slowly, which was really, really good because you had to focus and be able to play through it and not die all the time. But the problem is that if you died, if you fell down one of them, you had to start all the way from the beginning. And it's a classic thing that a lot of people get really, really like upset about because you have to redo an entire section. And that was definitely a fault of mine because, like others have said, like you get used to playing your own level. So for me, super simple. I could get through it. Anyone who picked it up and started playing, not good at it at all. And I think that's something that still a lot of people make that mistake simply because you go like, oh no, this seems fine, because in the back of your mind, no alarm bells are ringing. But that alarm bell should be ringing because everyone makes that mistake.
Yeah, I definitely have many times. I think that the thing that I sort of screwed up on early on with level design was that I was really, really designing levels just for me, just the kind of levels that I would want to play, which is totally fine, and I think it's important to do, and you should definitely do it, but you have to keep in mind the game that you're making and the audience that you're going for. If it's a bigger game and it's not just your indie game, I did a lot of non-linear paths and branching stuff, and here's the stealthy route, and here's the sort of in-your-face, guns blazing route, and no matter what we did to mark them down, like there was no way to message that to the player. Like you could never just, without breaking the rules of the game and the conventions of the game, just be like, here's the stealthy route this way, here's the loud shooty route this way, because of the constraints of the specific game. So I tried, and everyone kept giving me feedback. Like, I don't know how I'm supposed to know one way it was better over the other. Like, what's the value of one route over another route? I tried all sorts of things. I tried like lines on the ground to sort of like denote like specific locations, because you would get so turned around because a lot of the space was just like hallways and like a bunker is like hallways and rooms that all look kind of similar, and the lighting was sort of similar because it's underground. So nothing we did solve that problem, and I was very insistent that it could be solved. And instead, I should have been like, this is not the space for this. This is just because I enjoy that kind of thing. This doesn't mean it's the correct choice for this space. And we ended up making the entire space linear, and then just focusing on each space being really interesting. And I think that was a much better choice. But man, I fought for the longest time, and I was wrong about making it a non-linear space, just because that's what I, as a player of these types of games, wanted to do. And it didn't make sense for the story either. It was like the penultimate piece of the game. It was like the crescendo of the game, and the bad guy knew you were coming. So why would you be able to stealth around a space and him not know you were there? And once we decided, like, no, he just knows you're there, and everyone's on duty, and no one's doing like little like animations where they're hanging out drinking and just like chilling out. They're like waiting for you to show up. It just made the game so much better. But man, I fought that really, really hard at first, because that's what I personally wanted to play, and that wasn't really the right choice for the game.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you later this week. I don't know if we're coming back on Wednesday or Thursday, but we'll be back Friday with another interview for y'all. Bye.